3 days ago, something happened that no camera was supposed to capture. Jonathan Roumie, the man who portrays Jesus Christ in The Chosen, received devastating news backstage at a Dallas conference. Charlie Kirk, the influential conservative commentator, had just lost his younger sister Emma to cancer that morning. The news wasn't public yet. Kirk was scheduled to speak in 20 minutes, but he was barely holding himself together in his private preparation room. What happened next defied every expectation and shattered every barrier between Hollywood faith and political conviction. Roumie, who had never spoken to Kirk before, made a decision that would ripple across America. Without hesitation, without cameras, without any audience, he walked directly to Kirk's room and knocked on the door. When Kirk answered, his eyes red with grief and his confidence completely stripped away, Roumie said something that would later be described as the most powerful words spoken between two public figures in decades. The conversation that followed lasted exactly 17 minutes. Security footage captured only shadows under the door and muffled voices, but what those voices contained was about to transform two men and unite an entire nation. Kirk had built his career on never showing vulnerability. Roumie had carefully balanced acting with genuine faith. Neither man knew this private moment would become the most watched spiritual encounter of the decade. The most remarkable part? It almost never happened. Roumie was actually leaving early when he overheard staff discussing Kirk's situation. Something he would later describe as an unmistakable calling stopped him in his tracks. He turned around and asked for directions to Kirk's room. What followed was 17 minutes that reminded America who we really are beneath all the division. But here's what makes this incredible. What happened after those 17 minutes was captured on camera. When you see Kirk's face as he walked onto that stage, when you hear his voice addressing 3,000 people while carrying the power of Roumie's prayer, you'll understand why this is being called a modern miracle. The transformation was so profound that even skeptics questioned what they had witnessed. This is the story of authentic love in action. Of 17 minutes of genuine prayer that healed wounds years of rhetoric never could touch. What you're about to discover will restore your faith in the fundamental goodness that still exists in the American heart. By the end, you'll understand why millions are calling this prayer the moment that changed everything. If you're feeling the power of this story, smash that like button and subscribe with notifications on, because what comes next will show you exactly how 17 minutes created the miracle America desperately needed. What you're about to learn about Charlie Kirk's hidden struggle will shock you. 4 months, while millions watched him defend conservative values with unshakable confidence, Kirk was privately battling the most devastating crisis of his life. His 23-year-old sister Emma wasn't just fighting cancer, she was losing a 2-year war that Kirk had kept completely secret from his massive audience. Every bold statement, every powerful speech, every confident debate was delivered while his heart was slowly breaking. The weight of this secret had begun crushing him. Close friends later revealed that Kirk would finish recording his podcast, then immediately drive 3 hours to spend nights at Emma's bedside. He funded experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, flying her to specialists across the country. Yet publicly, he never mentioned it once. His audience of millions had no idea their strong, unwavering leader was privately begging God for a miracle that never came. Jonathan Roumie faced his own hidden burden. Playing Jesus Christ in The Chosen had brought him global recognition, but it also created an impossible standard. Every public appearance, every interview, every interaction was scrutinized through the lens of his portrayal of Christ. The pressure to be perfect, to always have the right words, to embody the character he played, had left him questioning whether he was worthy of such a role. Privately, Roumie struggled with anxiety about disappointing the millions who saw him as more than just an actor. That morning in Dallas, these two hidden worlds were about to collide in the most unexpected way. Kirk had received the call at 6:47 a.m. Emma had passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family. By 7:30 a.m., he was on a plane to Dallas, honoring a commitment he'd made months earlier. His team begged him to cancel. His closest advisors said no one would blame him. But Kirk insisted on speaking, believing that backing out would somehow dishonor his sister's memory. Meanwhile, Roumie was battling his own crisis of faith that morning. He'd received harsh criticism online from religious leaders who questioned whether an actor should portray Jesus Christ. The attacks had intensified over the past week, with some calling his work blasphemous, and others demanding he step down from the role. He'd barely slept, wondering if he was causing more harm than good to the faith he deeply cherished. Neither man knew the other was struggling. Kirk's pain was raw and immediate, the fresh grief of losing his best friend and confidant. Roumie's pain was deeper and longer-lasting, the crushing weight of trying to live up to an impossible standard while serving something greater than himself. Both men had arrived at that Dallas conference carrying burdens they felt they couldn't share with anyone. But here's what makes their upcoming encounters so remarkable. In that moment of collision between private grief and public faith, something sacred was about to happen. Two men who had never spoken were about to discover that their individual struggles had prepared them for this exact moment. Kirk's raw vulnerability would meet Roumie's authentic compassion, and the result would create a healing neither man saw coming. The conference organizers had no idea they were hosting two men on the edge of personal crisis. The audience had no clue that their afternoon speakers were carrying such heavy burdens. Even the security cameras couldn't capture the spiritual battle that was about to unfold in that backstage hallway. What was about to happen between these two men would prove that sometimes our deepest wounds become the very places where miracles are born. The collision course was set, but what happened when these two broken hearts met will leave you speechless. Hit that like button if you're ready to witness how God uses our darkest moments to create His brightest miracles. And make sure you're subscribed because the next section reveals the exact moment everything changed. The knock on Charlie Kirk's door came at exactly 2:43 p.m. Kirk was sitting on the floor of his preparation room, still in his travel clothes, holding his phone with the last text message Emma had sent him 3 days earlier. "Can't wait to hear your speech, big brother. Make me proud." When he opened the door, he expected to see an event coordinator or his assistant. Instead, he found Jonathan Roumie standing in the hallway, and something in the actor's eyes immediately told Kirk that this wasn't a casual meeting. "I heard about your sister," Roumie said softly, his voice carrying a gentleness that seemed to cut right through Kirk's defensive walls. "I know we've never met, but I felt like I needed to come find you." Kirk's carefully constructed composure, the same composure that had carried him through hundreds of interviews and debates, crumbled in that instant. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped aside and let Roumie into the room, closing the door behind them. What happened next defied every expectation of how two public figures from different worlds should interact. There was no small talk, no political discussion, no awkward introduction. Roumie looked at Kirk and said, "I know you're supposed to speak in a few minutes, but would it be okay if I prayed with you first? Not for the cameras, not for the audience, just for you and for Emma." Kirk, a man who had built his career on having quick, confident responses to everything, could only nod. The prayer that followed lasted 12 minutes, but witnesses later said it felt like both an eternity and an instant. Roumie didn't pray like a performer or an actor playing a role. He prayed like a brother talking to his father about another brother who was drowning. His words weren't polished or prepared, they were raw, honest, and filled with a compassion that seemed to reach directly into Kirk's broken heart. He prayed for Emma's peace, for Kirk's strength, for healing that goes beyond physical restoration. But here's what made this moment truly extraordinary. Halfway through the prayer, Kirk began to weep in a way he hadn't since childhood. Not the controlled tears of a public figure managing emotion, but the deep, soul-shaking sobs of a man finally releasing grief he'd been carrying alone for 2 years. Roumie never stopped praying, never pulled away, never tried to comfort Kirk with empty words. Instead, he placed his hand on Kirk's shoulder and prayed with even more intensity, as if he was literally fighting spiritual battles on Kirk's behalf. The transformation began immediately. Kirk's breathing, which had been shallow and anxious all morning, deepened and steadied. The tension that had gripped his shoulders for months began to release. Most remarkably, his face, which had been marked by exhaustion and grief, began to change. Later, Kirk would describe it as feeling like someone was physically lifting weight off his chest, as if the spiritual burden he'd been carrying was being transferred to someone else who was strong enough to bear it. When the prayer ended, both men sat in complete silence for nearly 3 minutes. Kirk wiped his eyes and looked at Roumie with an expression of wonder that defied description. "I don't understand what just happened," he said, "but I feel like Emma is somehow okay now. Like she's not gone, she's just somewhere else, and she's proud of me." Roumie smiled through his own tears and replied, "That's because she is okay, and she is proud of you. That's what love does. It transcends everything, even death." The most powerful part came when Kirk stood up to prepare for his speech. The man who walked toward the mirror was not the same man who had been sitting on the floor 20 minutes earlier. His eyes were clear, his posture was strong, and something indefinable but unmistakable had changed in his very presence. Roumie watched this transformation and later said he felt like he had witnessed a genuine miracle. Not the kind you read about, but the kind you experience personally. As Kirk prepared to leave the room, he turned back to Roumie and said something that would later be shared with millions. "I don't know why you came to find me today, but I know it wasn't coincidence. Thank you for showing me what Jesus would actually do." Roumie's response was simple but profound. "I didn't do anything. I just made space for love to do what love does best, heal what seems impossible to heal." What happened when Kirk walked onto that stage will blow your mind and move your heart in ways you never expected. Smash that like button if you're feeling the power of authentic prayer, and make sure you're subscribed because the next section shows you exactly how this private miracle became a public transformation that left 3,000 people in absolute awe. At 3:15 p.m., Charlie Kirk was scheduled to deliver a standard 30-minute speech on faith and conservative values in modern America. What actually happened on that stage left 3,000 people speechless and created the most viral faith moment of the decade. The man who walked onto that platform was so transformed that people in the front row later said they had to double-check their programs to make sure it was really Charlie Kirk. The change was immediately visible. Kirk's usual confident stride had been replaced by something deeper, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from within. His voice, typically sharp and commanding, carried a gentleness that no one in that audience had ever heard before. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Gone was the familiar intensity of a political warrior. Instead, there was a peace so profound that several audience members later said they felt it from their seats. Kirk began by completely abandoning his prepared remarks. "I was supposed to talk to you today about political strategy and cultural battles," he said, his voice steady but soft. "But 30 minutes ago, something happened that changed everything I thought I knew about faith, about loss, and about what really matters." The audience, expecting his usual fiery rhetoric, leaned forward in confused anticipation. What happened next has been called the most authentic moment of vulnerability ever captured at a political conference. Kirk told them about Emma. For the first time in 2 years, he shared her story publicly, her courage during treatment, her unwavering faith despite her circumstances, her final text message encouraging him to make her proud. As he spoke, you could hear the collective intake of breath from 3,000 people realizing they were witnessing something sacred. But here's where the story takes an extraordinary turn. As Kirk described the prayer he had just experienced with Jonathan Roumie, something supernatural began happening in that auditorium. People throughout the crowd started weeping, not the polite tears of a moved audience, but the deep, cleansing tears of people experiencing genuine spiritual breakthrough. A hardened political journalist in the third row was seen openly sobbing. A skeptical blogger who had come to critique Kirk's message was filming with trembling hands. The transformation reached its peak when Kirk did something unprecedented. He invited the entire audience to join him in a moment of silence for everyone who had lost someone they loved. "Emma taught me that love doesn't end with death," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "It just changes form. So let's take a moment to feel the love of those we've lost, knowing they're still with us in ways we can't fully understand." What followed was the most powerful minute of silence ever recorded at a public event. 3,000 people, many of them strangers, were united in a moment of shared grief and hope. Cell phone videos captured people holding hands across aisles, comforting strangers who were crying, and experiencing a connection that transcended every political and cultural divide in that room. The standing ovation that followed lasted for 11 minutes. But this wasn't the typical applause of an impressed audience. This was the response of people who had witnessed something they couldn't fully explain but knew they would never forget. Conference organizers later said they had never seen anything like it in 20 years of hosting events. The most remarkable testimonies came from people who had attended specifically to challenge or critique Kirk. A progressive activist who had live-tweeted criticisms throughout other sessions posted, "I came here to oppose everything this man represents. Instead, I experienced something that reminded me we're all human beings carrying pain and hope. I don't agree with his politics, but I can't deny what I just witnessed." By the time Kirk finished speaking, social media was exploding. Videos of his speech were being shared across every platform, transcending typical political boundaries. Conservative accounts, liberal accounts, faith-based pages, and secular outlets were all posting clips with captions like, "This changed everything," and "Faith beyond politics." Within hours, #MSLove was trending nationally. But perhaps the most powerful moment came as Kirk left the stage. In the wings, Jonathan Roumie was waiting, and the two men embraced in full view of the audience. The crowd's response to seeing these two figures, one representing political conservatism, the other Hollywood faith, united in genuine brotherhood, was unlike anything conference organizers had ever witnessed. What happened next will absolutely shock you. The ripple effects of this moment reached far beyond that auditorium and began healing wounds across America that many thought were impossible to mend. Hit that like button if you're amazed by the power of authentic faith, and stay subscribed because the next section reveals how this single prayer started a movement that's still changing lives today. What happened in the 12 hours following Kirk's speech defied every prediction about how Americans respond to authentic vulnerability. By 9 p.m. that evening, the video of his transformation had been viewed over 2 million times across all platforms. But these weren't typical political shares or partisan reactions. Something unprecedented was happening. Americans from every background, every political affiliation, every faith tradition were responding with their own stories of loss and healing. The breakthrough came when a Democratic senator from California, who had been one of Kirk's harshest critics, posted a video response that shocked the political world. Senator Maria Rodriguez, still in tears, shared how Kirk's story had reminded her of losing her own brother to addiction 3 years earlier. "I have spent 3 years angry at Charlie Kirk's politics," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Tonight, I'm reminded that behind every political position is a human being carrying pain I might not understand. Charlie, I'm sorry for your loss, and thank you for reminding me who we are beneath all the noise." Within hours, her post had generated responses from politicians across the aisle. Republican governors were sharing their own stories of grief. Democratic representatives were posting about family members they'd lost. Independent voters were commenting about feeling seen and heard for the first time in years. The comment sections, typically battlegrounds of partisan warfare, had become spaces of genuine human connection and mutual support. But the most powerful responses came from ordinary Americans who had never shared their stories publicly before. Sarah Martinez, a single mother from Phoenix, posted a video through tears. "My daughter was killed by a drunk driver 2 years ago. I stopped believing in prayer, stopped believing in God, stopped believing in people. Watching Charlie and Jonathan today, seeing how love can still break through when everything feels hopeless, it gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope." The ripple effect reached into the most unexpected places. A mosque in Detroit organized an impromptu prayer service for all families who had lost children. A synagogue in Brooklyn opened its doors for an interfaith memorial gathering. Catholic churches across the country reported increased attendance at evening services, with many parishioners specifically mentioning Kirk's story as what brought them back to prayer. The transformation was most visible in social media spaces that had become toxic battlegrounds. Facebook groups dedicated to political fighting saw their comment sections flooded with personal stories of loss and healing. Twitter threads that started as partisan attacks evolved into support networks for grieving families. Instagram accounts that had been spreading division began sharing resources for grief counseling and community support. Television news anchors, trained to maintain professional composure, began breaking down on air while reporting the story. CNN's Anderson Cooper ended his evening broadcast by sharing his own experience of losing his brother. Fox News' Tucker Carlson opened his show with a rare moment of personal vulnerability about his father's death. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow paused mid-segment to address how Kirk's story had affected her personally. The most extraordinary testimonies came from viewers who described physical healing that seemed connected to witnessing Kirk's transformation. Margaret Thompson, a 67-year-old widow from Ohio, wrote, "I have been carrying guilt about my husband's death for 5 years, blaming myself for not recognizing his heart attack symptoms sooner. Watching Charlie receive that prayer and seeing his face change, something broke loose in my chest. For the first time since Robert died, I can breathe again." Child psychologists began reporting that children who had lost parents or siblings were asking to watch Kirk's speech, saying it helped them understand that their loved ones were okay somewhere else. Grief counselors across the country said they received more calls in 1 week than they typically get in 3 months, with people specifically referencing Kirk's story as what motivated them to finally seek help. The phenomenon reached international audiences when translated versions of Kirk's speech went viral in over 30 languages. A father in Germany posted about losing his son and feeling understood by an American politician he'd never heard of. A mother in Japan shared how the prayer between Kirk and Roumie had helped her process her daughter's death. A pastor in Nigeria said Kirk's vulnerability had given him permission to share his own grief with his congregation. Perhaps the most moving development was the emergence of Emma's Legacy groups in cities across America. Informal gatherings where people who had experienced loss could come together to share stories, pray together, and support one another. These groups included Republicans and Democrats, Christians and Muslims, believers and skeptics, all united by the recognition that grief and love transcend every other difference. What happened when Charlie Kirk and Jonathan Roumie decided to meet again, and how their continued friendship is healing America's deepest wounds, will leave you believing in miracles again. Smash that like button if the story is touching your heart, and make sure you're subscribed because the final sections reveal how this prayer is still changing lives and bringing hope to millions who thought healing was impossible. 2 weeks after that life-changing prayer, Charlie Kirk received a text that would change everything. "How are you holding up, brother? Emma would be proud." Jonathan Roumie's simple message sparked the most unlikely friendship in American public life, one that's now quietly healing a divided nation. Their first real conversation was a 3-hour phone call neither planned. What started as gratitude became the kind of deep, honest talk most public figures never experience. The breakthrough came when Kirk admitted, "I've been so focused on winning political battles that I forgot we're all on the same team as human beings." Roumie's response was immediate. "That's what Emma's prayer taught us. Love doesn't have a political party." What happened next surprised everyone. Kirk and Roumie began meeting regularly, not for publicity, but as friends processing grief and purpose together. Despite coming from opposite worlds, conservative politics and Hollywood faith, they discovered they shared the same heart for healing America's wounds. Their joint appearances became legendary. At a veterans event in Colorado, instead of separate speeches, they shared a conversation about loss and hope that left 2,000 veterans in tears. A Marine who'd lost 3 brothers said, "I've heard speeches about sacrifice, but I've never seen 2 men model what it looks like to lay down your weapons and love your neighbor." The friendship transformed their individual work. Kirk's commentary became less combative, more focused on common ground. Roumie's faith discussions emphasized love bridging divides rather than creating them. Together, they launched The Wednesday Call, a weekly conversation drawing 500,000 viewers from across the political spectrum, creating space where Democrats and Republicans find common ground. The impact on families has been extraordinary. Jennifer Walsh from Michigan wrote, "My father and I hadn't spoken in 2 years because of politics. Watching Charlie and Jonathan choose friendship over division gave us a model. We had dinner together last week for the first time since 2021. Their friendship inspired other public figures to model similar unity. Politicians who were enemies began appearing together. Faith leaders started collaborating. Media personalities explored constructive approaches to division. Most remarkably, they launched Emma's Bridge, a foundation supporting grieving families while promoting unity across all divides. What you're about to discover in our final section will show you how this prayer continues working miracles today, and how you can experience the same healing power in your own relationships. Hit that like button if you're inspired by friendship that transcends politics, and stay subscribed because the conclusion gives you practical ways to bring this unity into your own life. Today, 6 months after Jonathan Roumie's prayer for Charlie Kirk, something extraordinary is still happening across America. Every single day, people are sharing stories of how that 17-minute encounter changed their lives, healed their relationships, and restored their faith in human goodness. What began as one man's darkest hour has become a beacon of hope for millions who thought healing was impossible. Just last week, in a small church in Ohio, Pastor David Miller shared how watching Kirk's transformation gave him courage to be vulnerable with his congregation about his own struggles with depression. "I realized that my people didn't need me to be perfect," he said through tears. "They needed me to be real." That Sunday, for the first time in 30 years of ministry, he asked his congregation to pray for him. The response was overwhelming, not judgment, but love, support, and a deeper connection than his church had ever experienced. The ripple effects continue growing in the most unexpected places. Lisa Chen, a high school teacher in California, showed Kirk's speech to her students during a lesson on empathy and civil discourse. One student, Marcus, who had been bullying classmates, broke down crying and apologized to everyone he had hurt. "If Mr. Kirk could be that honest about his pain," Marcus said, "maybe I could be honest about mine too." That classroom is now known throughout the school as a safe space where students support each other through difficult times. Corporate America has felt the impact too. Tech CEO Amanda Rodriguez credits Kirk and Roumie's friendship with transforming her company culture. "We stopped seeing our employees as political opponents and started seeing them as human beings with stories," she explained. Her company now holds monthly humanity hours, where employees from different political backgrounds share personal stories and find common ground. Productivity has increased 40%, and employee satisfaction has reached all-time highs. The most powerful testimonies come from families torn apart by political division who found healing through this story. The Peterson family in Texas hadn't celebrated holidays together for 3 years due to political arguments. After watching Kirk's speech together, they spent 4 hours talking honestly about their fears, hopes, and love for each other. "We realized we were so busy being right that we forgot to be family," said grandmother Betty Peterson. Emma's story reminded us what actually matters. Mental health professionals report unprecedented changes in their practices. Dr. Sarah Williams, a grief counselor in Florida, says she's had more breakthrough moments in 6 months than in the previous 6 years. "People are finally giving themselves permission to feel their pain instead of hiding it," she explains. Charlie and Jonathan modeled that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the doorway to healing. The international impact continues expanding. Churches in South Korea are sharing Kirk's story as an example of authentic faith. Synagogues in Israel are discussing how vulnerability can bridge religious differences. Mosques in London are using the prayer as an example of interfaith compassion. The message is universal: love transcends every barrier we create. But perhaps the most remarkable development happened just 2 weeks ago. Charlie Kirk returned to Emma's grave for the first time since her funeral. This time, he wasn't alone. Jonathan Roumie was with him, along with dozens of people whose lives had been changed by their story. Together, they held a prayer service that was attended by Republicans and Democrats, Christians and Muslims, believers and skeptics, all united by their experience of healing through authentic love. Kirk's words at Emma's graveside captured the miracle perfectly. "6 months ago, I thought your death was the end of everything beautiful in my life. Now I see it was the beginning of something more beautiful than I ever imagined. Your love didn't die, it multiplied. It's healing people I'll never meet, bringing together families I'll never know, and creating hope in places I'll never visit. You're still making me proud, little sister." The tears that followed weren't tears of grief, they were tears of gratitude, wonder, and hope. Americans from every background, every belief system, every political affiliation, weeping together not because they were sad, but because they had witnessed love doing what love does best, healing what seemed impossible to heal. This is why America wept together. Not because we're broken, but because we remembered we're human. Not because we're divided, but because we discovered what unites us is stronger than what separates us. Not because we're hopeless, but because 17 minutes of authentic prayer proved that miracles still happen when love meets pain with compassion. The miracle continues every day in conversations between former enemies, in families choosing love over politics, in communities building bridges instead of walls. Emma Kirk's legacy isn't just in heaven, it's alive in every act of compassion her story inspires, in every prayer offered for a stranger's pain, in every choice to see humanity in those we disagree with. If this story has touched your heart, if you felt the power of authentic love breaking through division, then you're part of the miracle too. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs hope, and subscribe because love stories like this remind us who we really are beneath all the noise. America doesn't weep because we're broken, America weeps because we remember we're family.